Hello everyone. Great to see everybody here on Zoom. So this is our for the year, for the short term, for the time period, our last Zoom. Hopefully we're not forced to go back into them, and they're optional from here on out. So that'd be ideal. We've really enjoyed doing the webinars. It's definitely simple for getting information out there, but there's a lot that we miss. So we are OBA. Then, as you can see here, that's the Organic Horticulture Benefits Alliance. What we do is we teach organics, trying to get landscapers, homeowners, anybody who can, thinking a little bit on how to do it better. So that could be the type of fertilizer, that could be the type of soap people use. However it is, especially food, landscape stuff, anything like that, we're all about doing it a little bit better. And I couldn't do it without these incredible volunteers. These board of directors work so hard to get this organization going. As you can see, there's our staff. Me and Erica, we work hard too. Really growing really quickly. It's pretty amazing. These folks are on there. Everybody plays really incredible roles. I mean, Sarah functions also as our marketing director. Just does an incredible job getting our beautiful artwork out there and spreading the word so good. Mike is president, does a lot of just big picture thinking. Vicki has really done a great job doing a lot of outreach. So just everybody on this board is working really hard. Carmelo there is also on the board of directors, but he was really pivotal in getting our Spanish language workshops going. And as we're learning, it's the only thing of its kind. So we'll do that again for sure. Here's our advisory board, just renowned professionals in our field. And we love seeing them and hearing from them. So this growing organization is really doing really great work, and really proud of what we're seeing. We are membership based. A lot of our funding comes from simply the donations of members joining up. So that is what we're looking for. And like this webinar is free to our members. So anybody that is here is a member, or they paid a little bit to come on here. But really good stuff, and just everybody's working hard to do it right. This is our event today, and so you guys have already seen this, but I'm so excited because Doug is just one of my favorite writers, authors, speakers, and super jazzed about him being on here. This one doesn't have his new book, which is super excited, and I'm sure he's going to touch on that today. We have to thank, and are so proud to thank, our sponsors, and we're going to start doing that now. So the sponsors really add to this, and they make these events great. They're the ones that allow us to bring in incredible speakers like Doug, and so that's really great stuff. Clark Condon, phenomenal landscape architect. They just do such an incredible job, and they know natives, they know edibles, they know forests, they know the ecology, and you can see there, this is just a beautiful picture by some signage, and just really trusted in our city as people doing it really incredibly. Arbor True, Organic Tree Care says it there. This is, for me, the best arbor company in the city, and really they work all over the nation. So as far as I know, the nation, just doing a great job. Brad Phillips, he's a board member and the owner, and really loves trees, really loves healing sick trees and seeing from the roots up on just that health. Microlife, they make all organic biological fertilizers, and it's kind of phenomenal because they have all these incredible liquids that you can use to take to the soil quicker. Really nice when it's wet out to use those liquids, because sometimes it's really hard to fertilize the soil when the water's washing everything away. But all those liquids you can foliar spray. So super seaweed, ocean harvest, molasses are some of my favorites. Healthy soils, healthy plants, healthy people. The Rice Organization, a truly phenomenal landscape company, mostly residential spaces, but really kind of does an incredible job of finding the passion and the interest of the homeowner and then tailoring it to that. These are really tell a story. They love flowers. They love natives. It's really cool stuff. This picture on the bottom always, I think it's so cool. Trailing roses around the little, I guess maybe it's a she shed. I don't know, maybe man cave. Probably a she shed. It's lovely. FNS, Horticulture Services, also does residential stuff. They have some strikingly beautiful sites, and they do some really creative and interesting work. So Shahid is a longtime supporter of OBA, and is just like, I just want to support the program this year, so put me on there. And we're like, give us some pictures, show off. He's like, no, I just want to support. Well, they're awesome, so we're going to verbally show off. Imagine a beautiful landscape. They can do that. So really cool stuff. Of course, Home Show Garden Pros. Look, there's me right in the middle. So this is your Houston Garden Radio Show. So we talk about what works. We will touch on a lot of stuff that Doug kind of hits on, because He's always so influential and really gets us thinking about really cool stuff. But they do such a great job dishing out gardening information. And basically, we have a co-op of all these experts that jump on and talk to me, and I get them to go a little bit deeper, maybe than that. So it's really good stuff. So our next event, or what we have 2 August events, so that's kind of exciting. One of them is Kiss the Ground. So we are taking this movie showing to Fayette County. And so if you're out that way at all during this time on this day, check us out, August 19th. Really going to be a lot of fun. The movie is phenomenal. If you haven't seen it, it's on Netflix actually, and you can just check it out there. If you can get out to to Fayette County, we'd love for that to be the case. But it's impactful, and it's just putting a bunch of data in front of folks, and they can respond. And encourages a few ways to respond. Some of which are just letting your dollar kind of make that statement for you. Also in August, we have our kind of annual organic gardening workshop, and we have these incredible 4 speakers touching on these things. How to prepare for ultimate success now, native plants, veggie growing, and then Brad Phillips is going to be our keynote speaker. Trees talk, so basically talking about the communication that trees are doing with each other and how we can participate in that communication. They're really cool stuff. It's going to be phenomenal. We'll have some live bites and snacks. Make sure you're fed. We don't want anybody getting hangry. That's never a thing. We always got to avoid the hanger at all possible. But this will be a phenomenal workshop. So look us up, sign up there. We are offering scholarships here. So if you need a scholarship or know someone that you really need to go, let us know, and we will make sure they get there. Again, just a reminder to join OBA. This is our lifeblood, and we take a picture of this and share with your friends and family, because the more members we get, the more we can do, and it's just kind of what it comes down to. The more members we get, the broader network we see, the more impact we have, and I really believe in our impact. And so, take a screenshot here. So without further ado, I'm going to stop my sharing, but I'm going to keep talking. And so, really, what I want you guys to encourage, make Doug. Doug's got to get up his. Oh, Erica, will you make Doug the host so he can share his screen? Thank you. So Doug Tallamy has written multiple books. Nature's Best Hope, Bringing Nature Home are 2 that really encourage you to consider your impact on populations of birds, populations of all kinds of things. And he's really identified oak trees as this kind of secret to unlock. And so I know that everybody that was there last time we heard Doug speak was really moved in reconsidering what they do with their trees, how they treat their lawn weeds, or as we've come to call them, their urban meadow, and just really impactful. And so without further ado, renowned author, scholar, and a bug man, Doug Tallamy. Go ahead and unmute yourself there, Doug.
Okay, I've done it, right? Confirm. Can anybody hear me? And
yes, you sound great. You sound great.
Good. Okay, yes. Well, I do want to talk to you tonight about my idea of what nature's best hope is. But before I do that, I want to return to what happened, at least in the East, in 2019. We have what we call an oak mast. Members of the Red Oak group got together and decided to make their acorns at the same time. And this is what it looked like in a lot of places. Well, I'm easily entertained. So I took one of those acorns and I just stared at it. And I was rewarded because an insect started to chew its way out of the acorn. First, it chewed a little hole for its head. And it forced its head through there. And then it forced its entire body through that hole. It was a tight squeeze, looked like the Pillsbury Doughboy. Finally, it plopped down. This is a very dangerous time for this insect larva because it's good to eat. Many things are after it. So it gets to safety by wiggling and squirming beneath the soil surface. It takes about 30 seconds. And once it's underground, it stretches in all directions and forms a chamber. And within that chamber, it converts itself to a pupa. And it stays there for 2 years. After 2 years, it comes out as an acorn weevil. That's what a weevil looks like. A lot of people think they have big noses. because it looks like they do, but that's actually an extension of the head capsule, and the mouth parts are way down here at the end of that extension. They take those mouth parts, chew a hole down to the center of the acorn, turn around and lay an egg in that hole, and that's how the larva gets into the acorn. You might wonder why they spend 2 years underground. Why don't they come out the next year like most insects? And the answer is that it takes red oak acorns 18 months to complete their development. Maybe somebody can help me out here. I think I'm supposed to allow people in from their waiting room, and I keep clicking, but I don't know if I'm accomplishing that. So somebody can think about that. I don't know. I don't want to leave anybody stuck in the waiting room. So, all right, takes red oak acorns 18 months to complete their development. So if the acorn weevils came out the very next year, there wouldn't be enough acorns for them. Once they leave the acorn, that leaves a hole, a true vacuum in the acorn. And you know that nature abhors a vacuum. And in this case, she has filled it with 3 species of temnothorax ants, tiny little ants where the entire colony lives in the holes made by acorn weevils in acorns. And if they find a new acorn, they're all excited because their old acorn's falling apart. So they tell everybody it is time to move. They get the larvae, they get the eggs, the entire colony moves into the new acorn, takes about 30 minutes. After they're in, they post a guard here, make sure nobody else comes in. And this is where they'll live for the next 2 years until this acorn falls apart. What's my point? My point is very simple. That is one of literally millions of very specialized interactions between animals and plants. And those interactions comprise the bulk of nature. This is another one, the relationship between jays and oaks. Jays are the primary disperser of oak acorns. They'll take an acorn and fly about a mile from the parent tree. Then they tap that acorn beneath the soil surface. And the object is they're going to go get that acorn for winter food, but they only remember where they store 1 out of every 4 acorns. So for every 4 acorns they store, they've planted 3 new oak trees. Here's another specialized interaction between pileated woodpeckers and carpenter ants. That's what they feed their young. So you won't have pileated woodpeckers unless you have lots of carpenter ants, and you won't have carpenter ants unless you have the big trees that make those carpenter ants. You won't have this bee, Andrena facilii, unless you have this plant, Phacelia. That is the only pollen that particular bee can rear its young on. And it turns out that pollen specialization is very common in our native bees. We have about 4,000 species of native bees, but over a third of them can only reproduce in the pollen of particular plants. So in the Midwest, there's at least 40 species that can only reproduce on the pollen of perennial sunflowers. I know this says 13, but the Midwest is a bigger place. You won't have Baltimore checker spots unless you have white turtlehead. And I could talk about nature specialized relationships all night long. The point I want to make, though, is that today these relationships, nature itself is on the ropes. And it's on the ropes because we did not take Teddy Roosevelt's advice. Way back in 1908, Teddy heard that the state of Arizona was going to mine the Grand Canyon. So he went to the canyon, looked out over the edge, and he said, leave it as it is. And with those 5 words, he started the process of creating the Grand Canyon National Park. Of course, leaving the country as it was is no longer an option because we didn't do that. There's only about 5% of the lower 48 states that's anything close to its original pristine ecological condition. And that's because we have logged the country repeatedly. We have tilled it. We have drained it. We've grazed it. We got 770 million acres of rangeland. That's 4.5 times the size of Texas, by the way. And of course, we've paved it or otherwise developed it. We have straightened our rivers and dammed them. And you can spell that any way you want. We have polluted our skies and changed our climate for centuries to come. We have drained our aquifers. We have introduced more than 3,300 species of plants from other continents, many of which are running amok in our natural areas. In short, we've carved up those natural areas into tiny remnants of their former selves. And each one of those remnants is too small and too isolated from other remnants to sustain the species that run the ecosystems that we all depend on. Why have we done all that? I don't know. I suspect we thought the Earth, our nest, was so big we could foul it forever and there wouldn't be any consequences. But of course, we were wrong about that. And that's why we're seeing headlines like this at a pretty regular clip. The insect apocalypse is here. What does it mean for the rest of life on Earth? Talking about global insect decline. Followed by this one, North America's lost 3 billion breeding birds in the last 50 years. That's almost a third of our breeding bird population already gone. And the UN says, well, gee, we're going to lose 1 million species to extinction probably in the next 20 years. And I love the way they report headlines like this as if it's an option. I mean, they might as well say we're going to lose oxygen in the next 20 years. Losing 1 million species is not something we can allow to happen. Can't do it. Can't do it. So I could go on talking about the pox that we humans have delivered upon the environment, thus upon all of our houses. But that's not what this talk is about. This talk is about a cure for that pox. And it's a cure that'll take small efforts from lots of people, but those efforts will deliver enormous physical, psychological, and environmental benefits to everybody. Let's return briefly to this headline. The insect apocalypse is here. What does it mean for the rest of life on Earth? Well, the great E.O. Wilson, the most famous entomologist of all times, told us what it would mean if Earth lost its insects. And he did it way back in 1987 in this paper called The Little Things That Run the World. And his message was very clear. Life as we know it depends on insects. And if they were to disappear, so would most of our flowering plants. And if most of our flowering plants disappeared, that would disrupt energy flow through our terrestrial habitats so severely that the food webs that support our animals, our amphibians, our reptiles, our birds, our mammals, even many of our freshwater fish, those food webs would collapse and those animals would disappear. The biosphere, the living portion of the Earth, would rot because we would have lost insect decomposers that as of now rapidly turn over nutrients. And all we would have is bacteria and fungi. And of course, humans would not survive any of those drastic changes. Good news is that doesn't have to happen. We can save our insects, we can save our birds, we can save nature itself, but we're going to have to change the way we landscape in order to do it. Why is that? Well, remember, humans are products of nature. We are totally dependent on what we call life support systems that are produced by ecosystems, ecosystem services. Here are some of the things that plants do that we all need. And remember, it's not just humans that need ecosystem services. Everything out there needs ecosystem services, like the production of oxygen, pretty important. Clean water, also pretty important. Carbon capture, enormously important in today's world. Plants are pulling carbon dioxide out of the atmosphere, out of harm's way, locking the carbon up in their tissue, and then pumping the extra carbon into the ground through their roots. Our soils are brown or black because of carbon that plant roots have deposited there over the eons. Plants are building topsoil and holding it in place. They're preventing floods. They're dampening severe weather. They convert sunlight to food. You know, if we lose our plants, we're going to have to eat sunlight ourselves. And I wish us luck on that. What do animals do for plants? They provide pest control services. They pollinate nearly 90% of our flowering plants. They disperse plant seeds. So designing landscapes that destroy the production of ecosystem services is just not a good idea. Never was a good idea, but today it's a downright terrible idea. Why? Because we got 7.8, 7.9 billion people on the planet. We need more ecosystem services today than ever before. Remember, humans are using more ecosystem services than other animals. So taking huge areas of the earth out of production is just not a good idea. Now, we have had visionaries through the ages who have recognized that we humans needed to work on our relationship with planet Earth. And Aldo Leopold was one of the most eloquent. He wrote extensively in the first half of the 1900s. And one of the things he said is the oldest task in human history is to live in a piece of land without spoiling it. And I have been indigenous groups that have been good at doing that, but you know, our huge Western societies and our huge Asian societies are terrible at doing that. We habitually take more from the earth than it has to offer, completely ruining an area, going to another area, doing the same thing. Clearly not sustainable behavior. So Aldo had a dream that we humans were actually capable of developing what he called a land ethic. In this dream, he knew we had to use the earth. We had to lumber and farm and graze and mine and do all those things. But he believed that we could learn to do it gently enough so that we did not destroy local ecosystems. And that's what he called the land ethic. And he wrote about it in the Sand County Almanac, his most famous book. What he did not talk about, though, was developing a land ethic where we actually lived. And I'm not sure why that was, but I suspect the notion that humans and nature cannot live in the same place, they cannot coexist at the same time in the same place, was so deeply embedded in the culture of Aldo Leopold's day. It's still embedded in our own culture, but he may not have recognized it as an option. Well, what I want to argue this evening is that not only is living with nature an option, it is now the only viable option that's left to us. In the past, of course, conservationists worked pretty much exclusively where there weren't a lot of people. We now need to turn that on its head. We need to save nature, actually reconstruct it where we've dismantled it, where there are a lot of people, because that's pretty much everywhere. In other words, we have to find ways for nature to thrive in human-dominated landscapes. Thrive, not hang on by a thread, not get diminished every single year, but thrive. Where should we start? Well, let's go back to private property. We can't ignore conservation on private property because most of the property is privately owned. 85.6% of the US east of the Mississippi is privately owned. I think 96% of Texas is privately owned. 78% of the entire country privately owned. If we don't do conservation on private property, we're going to fail. We can't afford to fail. So we have to consider private property in our conservation plans. There are a bunch of, there's low-hanging fruit out there, a number of acres that we could be practicing conservation on right now that we've been ignoring it for the most part. How about power and pipeline rights of ways? 21 million acres in those types of landscapes. 1 million acres is 1.5 times the size of Rhode Island. So we're talking about big areas here. Railroad rights of ways, another 3 million acres. Golf courses, 2 million acres. Airports, 3 million acres. The Denver airport's twice the size of Manhattan. These are big places. Roadside, 17 million acres. And then we have all the places we live, both in rural areas, suburbia, our cities, hundreds of millions of acres in those landscapes. If you add up just these, and you can think of other places, that's 599 million acres where we could be doing a lot better job with conservation than we are right now. How big is 599 million acres? It's big. It's bigger than Vermont, plus New Jersey, plus Maine, Virginia, New York, Georgia, Florida, Oklahoma, Montana, California, and even Texas combined. So not having a place to do conservation is not the issue. We can do conservation almost anywhere. Now, when I talk about conservation, I'm not using the word correctly. I'm not talking about conserving parts of nature that haven't already been destroyed. We do want to do that, of course, but I'm talking about putting it back together again where we have destroyed it, which is an awful lot of places. So it's really not called restoration either, because people will say, well, you're never going to put it back. You're not going to restore it to exactly what it was. True enough, but it doesn't mean we can't unite enough of those specialized interactions that I opened the talk with to create functional ecosystems again, even if it's not exactly what was in that place 200 or 300, 400 years ago. So in order to do this, we have to start with the building blocks of an ecosystem. Not all species contribute to ecosystem function equally. So we have to start with the most powerful groups, and then we can add the other groups later on. And two groups we cannot do without would be the flowering plants and the pollinators that allow them to reproduce. Flowering plants, of course, are capturing energy from the sun and through photosynthesis, turning it into food and then storing the food in their parts. Okay, now we got the sun's energy stored as food in plant parts, mostly leaves. Most animals don't eat plants. They eat invertebrates that ate those plants. And those invertebrates, for the most part, are insects. And it turns out that caterpillars are transferring more energy from plants to other animals than any other type of plant eater. So if you develop landscapes, if you design landscapes that don't have a lot of caterpillars in it, you've got a failed food web and essentially a dead landscape. Let me use the Carolina chickadee as an example. That is the chickadee that occurs in the South. It's the bird that's at our feeder all winter long and eating seeds. And people say, well, that's what chickadees need. And 50% of their diet during the winter is seeds. But when it comes time to reproduce, chickadees, like most birds, their babies cannot eat seeds. So they switch entirely to insects. And if they're in a healthy environment, they'll rear their young almost exclusively on caterpillars. And it turns out they are not exceptions. 96% of our terrestrial birds are rearing their young on insects, and most of those insects are caterpillars. How do I know that? There's a number of lines of evidence that suggest that, but this is a citizen science project that one of my grad students did recently, Ashley Kennedy. She put out a call to bird photographers to take pictures of birds during the breeding season when they were carrying food to the nests. And the object where they were supposed to send those pictures to Ashley, she was going to identify the prey items that were in the beaks of those birds and then reconstruct the nestling diet of the many species of birds in North America as she could. And you're looking at a summary of what she found. The green bars are the percentage of the nestling diets in these 20 bird families. That was caterpillars. And in 16 out of the 20 bird families, caterpillars dominated the diet. So imagine what would happen to the bulk of bird reproduction in North America if we design landscapes without enough caterpillars. Most of our birds would not be able to reproduce. So something special about caterpillars, what is it? Actually, there's several things special about caterpillars. And one of them is that they're soft. Think of this guy as if he's a little sausage with a very thin wrapper. The thin wrapper is the exoskeleton of the caterpillar. Remember, it's an arthropod, but it's made of chitin, and that is undigestible. So birds don't want a lot of chitin. And because caterpillars are soft, you can stuff them down the throat of your offspring without fear of injuring their esophagus. If you ever watched a parent bird rear their young, they're pretty rough. Their beak is like a plunger. They just stuff it down there. Caterpillars are also relatively large prey items. One medium-sized caterpillar is equal to the biomass of 200 aphids. And many of our smaller birds do chase aphids around, but do you want to chase 200 aphids or get one caterpillar? They're nutritious. They're very high in fat, very high in protein, low percentage of chitin compared to many other insects, particularly beetles. Beetles are not like little sausages. They're like little tanks. Much of a beetle is undigestible. And a lot of beetles have sharp edges too. And finally, it turns out that caterpillars are the best source of carotenoids for birds during the breeding season. Now, I mentioned carotenoids not because I love organic chemistry, but because I'm a vertebrate and you're a vertebrate. Birds are vertebrates, and we vertebrates cannot make our own carotenoids. Only plants make carotenoids. So we have to get our carotenoids from plants. And we have to get them from plants because carotenoids are essential components of vertebrate diets. And that's why my wife, Cindy, makes sure I have lots of carrots to get my beta carotene and lots of tomatoes to get my lycopene and lots of whatever that is to get my lutein. And when I eat those things, it stimulates my immune system. I cannot think of a better time to have a healthy immune system. They are antioxidants. They run around our body, protect our DNA from oxidative damage. Carotenoids improve color vision. When your mother said, eat your carrots, you will see better, she was right. She didn't know she was right, but it turns out she was right. Improve sperm vitality, improve sexual attractiveness. Now we're talking about things like this prothonotary warbler, who is bright yellow because he's had access to lots of luteins. And the brighter yellow he is, the more he takes those luteins and he makes pigments out of them, puts them in his feathers. And again, the brighter yellow he is, the more ladies he attracts. Where's he getting his carotenoids from? From the prey that he eats, of course. But look, carotenoid levels are not equally distributed among bird prey items. These first two bars are types of caterpillars. They have far more carotenoids than other types of bird prey. Here are the adult caterpillars down here, the moths and butterflies themselves. They don't have many carotenoids because they're not eating the green leaves. That's where the carotenoids are. And here's the earthworm way down here. So the early bird gets the worm, but he doesn't get any carotenoids when he gets the worm. So that study and a number of others are suggesting that caterpillars are not optional parts of bird diets. They're essential parts of bird diets. So let's just say birds need caterpillars. The next question is, how many caterpillars do they need? Is one or two enough? Is one or two a day enough? That's a good question. Let's go back to chickadees. We have a lot of data on chickadees. How many caterpillars does it take to make a clutch of chickadees? And the answer is it takes a lot of caterpillars. One or two is not enough. One or two a day is not enough. 6,000 to 9,000 caterpillars to get one clutch of chickadees to the point where they leave the nest. And that depends on the number of chicks in the nest. And after they leave the nest, the parents continue to bring them caterpillars for another 21 days, but they're flying all over so nobody can count those. So you're really talking about tens of thousands of caterpillars to get one clutch of chickadees that's a third of an ounce. That's 4 pennies worth of bird to the point of independence when they keep eating caterpillars. And if you want chickadees to breed in your yard, and I would think you do, because in so many places, that's all that's out there is our yards. You have to have all those caterpillars in your yard because chickadees forage about 50 meters from the nest. Most birds forage very close to the nest because they're making so many trips and take so much energy to do that. They are not flying 5 miles down the road to the nearest woodlot. And if we design landscapes that do not have all of those caterpillars, that's called insect decline. And it's really looking like that's directly related to the bird declines that people are measuring. We went to the original data set of Rosenberg et al. That's the group from the Smithsonian that says we've lost 3 billion birds in the last 50 years. And we divided the terrestrial bird species into 2 groups. the species that require insects at some part of their life history, typically when they're breeding, and the species that don't. Things like doves and finches that can actually feed their young seeds. They make a milk out of the seed, and that's how they reproduce. Well, those species didn't lose any numbers at all in the last 50 years, but the species that rely on insects lost on average 10 million individuals per species. This doesn't prove cause and effect, but it certainly is suggestive that as insects disappear from our human-dominated landscapes, there's not enough food for the birds, and they disappear as well. So we have to rethink the primary goal of our landscapes. In the past, the primary goal has been to be pretty. And that's, we brought plants in from all over the world, the prettiest plants, so we could have pretty landscapes without thinking about their ecological roles. Now we have to make ecologically functional landscapes, and if they're pretty too, that's great, but they've got to be ecologically functional because we're just losing too much ecosystem function to ignore that. So how do we landscape in a way that creates a lot of caterpillars? Well, you add caterpillars to landscapes by, of course, adding the plants that support those caterpillars, which seems easy enough, but there is a catch, and that is most plants do not support a lot of caterpillars. So we have to be fussy about which plants we put in our yards. And we have to be fussy about it because the caterpillars themselves are fussy. And the monarch butterfly illustrates that perfectly. You can have all the crepe myrtle, you can have all the boxwood, all the burning bush, all the hostas, all the camellias, all of the Asian plants that we decorate our landscapes with that you want, and you won't create any new monarch butterflies. The only thing that's going to make a monarch butterfly is milkweed. That's called host plant specialization. And it turns out that most of the insects that eat plants are host plant specialists. Why is that? Because plants have made them that way. Plants don't want to be eaten, so they capture the energy from the sun and use it for their own growth and reproduction. And they protect those tissues by loading them with nasty tasting chemicals, secondary metabolic compounds that make those tissues either bitter or downright toxic. And it's a very effective defense that keeps most of the insects of the world from eating most of the plants of the world. And that's why it's green out there in the summertime. It's not because there are no insects out there that want to eat those plants. It's because most of the insects that are out there cannot eat most of the plants. They are too well protected. But we do know that insects eat plants. So how do they do that? How do they get around those chemical defenses? Well, this is where the specialization comes in. 90% of our insects that eat plants are host plant specialists. Every plant lineage that's out there protects itself with a unique cocktail of chemical defenses. And an insect species can't adapt to all of them. That's too much to ask. So they pick one or two plant lineages that are really similar in how they protect themselves, and they get good over evolutionary time at developing the adaptations that help them get around those defenses. They produce the enzymes that store and excrete and detoxify those compounds, the behavioral adaptations and life history adaptations that allow the insects to avoid eating the compounds to begin with. But that does take a long period of exposure with the plant. These adaptations don't fall into place overnight. And once they do fall into place, the insect is then locked into eating that particular plant lineage. And that's why if you take milkweeds out of your landscape, the monarch doesn't start to eat your crepe myrtle. It's locked into milkweeds. So what does it do? It disappears. It dies. And of course, that's what we're seeing out there. And that's the problem with bringing in plants from other continents, because our insects have not developed the adaptations to eating those plants. So when we do that, and especially when those plants escape our gardens, become invasive species, and ecologically castrate all of our natural areas, that contributes to those insect declines that we're seeing. So all I'm trying to say here is that plant choice matters. If we're trying to rebuild food webs, we've got to choose the plants that will support the insects that support those food webs. And if we don't, it doesn't work. I'm going to give you 3 examples of how well it does work when we do choose the right plants. And I'm going to start with our house right here in Oxford, Pennsylvania. This is the house we built on a farm, part of a farm that was broken up not too long ago. It was a very old farm, farmed almost 300 years. It was exhausted. The last thing they did before they broke up the farm was mow it for hay. But when you're mowing for hay in this part of the country, you're really mowing all of the invasive plants that have escaped our gardens. You're mowing multiflora rose and oriental bittersweet and Japanese honeysuckle and bush honeysuckle and autumn olive and porcelain berry and miscanthus and barberry and Norway maple and ailanthus, all those guys. You mow them and you call that hay. And they're not feeding it to cattle, they're giving it to the mushroom industry. So it works to do that. But of course, once we built the house and they stopped mowing, what do you think came back? None of the rootstocks of those plants were dead. So the entire 10 acres were covered with Asian invasive species. So our goal from buying this property was to restore the biodiversity on these 10 acres. So step one was to get rid of these invasive plants that don't support the insects that everything else depends on. That's my wife, Cindy. She's getting ready to clear the 10 acres, and she did. I helped a little bit, but she's done the bulk of the work. So if you have a serious invasive species problem, don't give up. If Cindy can do it on 10 acres, you can do it too. And she did it mostly with manual. She did it entirely with manual labor. She won't touch pesticides. What was I doing while she was working hard? I was telling her she was doing a great job. But it was my job to put the plants back. And I chose the plants that I knew supported caterpillars that I wanted to see if they could colonize our little piece of land here. So one of the plants I started with was Canadian, or one of the target caterpillars I started with was a Canadian owlet. That's what a Canadian owlet looks like. It's a pretty little thing. That's what its adult looks just like a leaf. Well, Canadian owlets eat meadow rue, and we didn't have any meadow rue. There's no meadow rue anywhere around. The entire area was farmed to death. So the meadow rue has been gone for hundreds of years. So I had to get meadow rue seeds from someplace. I planted them. They grew very nicely. But, this was early on, and I had serious doubts about whether Canadian owlets would ever find my little patch of meadow rue. So I didn't even go out and check it for at least 2 months after I planted. Then I was walking by for some other reason, and I looked, the meadow rue were covered with Canadian owlets. They had found it right away. It was a big success. I'm still surprised about that. But now we have a good population of meadow rue and Canadian owlets. So we've added 2 species to the property. Same story with the goldenrod stowaway. That's a misnomer, by the way. This beautiful moth has nothing to do with goldenrod. It's a specialist on this plant, ditch daisy, Biden's aristosa. I did know where there were some Bidens about 14 miles away in a power line cut. So I got some Biden seeds, planted them at home. They grew very nicely. It took a year for the moth to find our Bidens, but they finally did. And now we've got a good population of both the Biden's aristosa and the goldenrod stowaway. So now I've added 4 species to the property. Same story with the hackberry emperor. Wanted the hackberry emperor, not because it's the prettiest butterfly in the US, but because it belongs here. It's a species that ought to be here, but like its name suggests, it's a specialist on hackberry, and we didn't have any hackberry. So I planted hackberry, had to wait 4 years for the butterfly to find our hackberry, but they did. And now we have a good population of both of those. So now we've added 6 species, and that's how it went. I didn't plant goldenrod, it came in on its own, but along with it came many of the things that depend on goldenrod, like the brown-hooded owlet. Hard to get a caterpillar prettier than that. The Arcedra flower moth, the goldenrod leaf miner, the distinct Sparaginothus, the goldenrod gall moth. This is one that hasn't come, the goldenrod flower moth. I don't know why it hasn't found our goldenrod. I think the deer eating the goldenrod has something to do with that. And that's what its caterpillars look like. But this is part of the fun. This is anticipation. It's like waiting for the ketchup to come out of the bottle. Every year I go out and I check my goldenrod and try to find these caterpillars. One of these years I'm going to find it, and that'll be a great day. Planted Virginia creeper. Yes, Virginia creeper. I hear that people don't like Virginia creeper. I just don't know why. It's a great native plant. It can climb our trees without girdling them, without pulling them down. It has great fall color. It's a good ground cover. It's a wonderful pollinator plant, believe it or not. Its flowers are small and inconspicuous. The only way you know it's in flower is because there's clouds of bees all around it. It really draws them in. Remember, when you're planting a garden for pollinators, do what the pollinators want, not what you want. It's not how showy the flower is for humans. It's how much it attracts those pollinators. And those pollinated flowers turn into very nutritious berries for the birds, high in fat, what they need in the fall. And it turns out that Virginia creeper is the best host plant for the large sphinx moths that support cardinal reproduction, like Pandora's Sphinx and its beautiful adult, and the lettered Sphinx, and the Hog Sphinx, and the Abbott Sphinx, all on Virginia creeper. I wanted to see if I get the double-toothed prominent, just because it's such a cool looking caterpillar. I mean, even if you don't like caterpillars, you got to love this guy. It's a specialist on elms, particularly American elm. And of course, we lost our elms to Dutch elm disease, but not at the University of Delaware. There's a couple big elms there that did not die. They still make a ton of seed every year. And I got some of those seeds, planted them at home, and they grew very nicely. They germinate in 6 days. And that was 19 years ago. Those trees are 80 feet tall now. Double-toothed prominent came right away. Another big success, American elm. I wanted to get the evening primrose moth because it's beautiful. I like beauty like anybody else. Well, it's only on evening primrose, Enithera. We didn't have any, so I planted that. Moth came. It spends the day with its head stuffed in the flowers. It's very cute. And I planted lots of oaks. Now, these are just examples of plant lineages that I put back on our property. This is the Bedford oak in Bedford, New York. And people argue about whether it's 400 years old or 500 years old. It's enormous. And I hear people say, "Well, I'm not gonna plant an oak because I won't live long enough to enjoy it." And if you can only enjoy your oak when it's 400 years old, you're right, you won't. But if you can enjoy what your oak is doing for your property ecologically, you can enjoy them almost from day one. And I can tell you that from experience because I planted most of our oaks as acorns, which means they're free, or as 2-foot bare root whips, which meant they cost $1.50 each. And immediately they started to rebuild the food web by bringing in the moths that support that food web. But things like the solitary oak leaf miner, Juvenal's dusky wing, the yellow-shouldered moth. What is this one? Suzuki's promolactus, the red wash caterpillar, the yellow-vested moth, the orange-tufted oneida, the spiny oak caterpillar, the two-spotted oak punky, the variable oak leaf caterpillar, the red-humped oakworm, the orange-humped oakworm, the pink-striped oakworm, the hesitant dagger moth, the lesser oak dagger moth, the greater oak dagger moth, the streaked dagger moth, the afflicted dagger moth, the crowned bucolatrix, the orange-patched smoky wing, the white-blotched heterocampa, the oblique heterocampa, the red-lined panapoda, the laugher, and literally hundreds more species of moths have come to the caterpillars have come to the oaks on my property, and they come right away. This is a pin oak that has just popped its head above the leaves, and here's a caterpillar standing on the ground eating the leaves of that oak. So you don't have to wait hundreds of years for your oak to start to contribute to the food web that you're trying to reconstruct in the ecosystem at your house. This is what our house looks like today. This is my Zoom room up here. I'm sitting up there. I show you this picture to convince you that we're very traditional. We've got lawn here, although my lawnmower broke and I haven't mowed it recently, but I will. But we also put a lot of plants back. And every time I put a new plant lineage in the yard, there was a chance that the moth species that depend on that plant lineage would colonize our yard. So 4 years ago, I made it a goal to take a picture of every species of moth that now makes a living at our house. And I'm still at it, but I am up to 1,125 species of moths that I have photographed at our house. Now remember, we've got 10 acres. Pennsylvania is 2.4 million acres. So on 1/240,000th of the land mass, we have 44% of all the moth species that occur in Pennsylvania. And because so many of these moth species are types of bird foods, we have recorded 60 species of birds that have bred on our 10 acres, not flew by, but bred. So remember, it takes thousands of caterpillars for a single pair to breed. We have thousands of caterpillars. Why am I telling you all this? Well, this was another headline that we saw last year, and that's the World Wildlife Fund says that 2/3 of Earth's wildlife have vanished since 1970. I love the way they say vanished, as if it's a mystery. We've killed them. We've killed 2/3 of the wildlife on planet Earth. But you know what? Not at our house. I'm sure we have increased biodiversity by 2/3, and it didn't take that long, and we did it simply by putting the plants back. So these are terrible headlines, but we can reverse it. Don't give up. Get motivated. Just put the plants back and we can turn this around. But I know what you're thinking. We've got 10 acres. What if you live in a smaller suburban plot? What if you live in a city? Will it work there? That's a good question. So let's go to Margie and Dan Terpstra's house in Kirkwood, Missouri. They have 0.6 acres, 18 times less land than Cindy and I have. And when they moved in, their yard was choked with the primary invasive plant there, which is Amur honeysuckle, bush honeysuckle. So the first thing they did was get rid of that. And then they planted a lot of native plants. And they put in a water feature they call a bubbler. And then they sat back and started to count the birds that use their yard. They are up to 149 bird species that are using their yard, including 35 warbler species. To put that in perspective, we've only recorded 8 warbler species at our house, and we've got 18 times more land. So does it work on smaller properties? Absolutely. By the way, the Terpstras live in the middle of suburbia. Everybody around them's got the big lawns. What about urban yards, though? Let's go to Pam Carlson's house in Chicago. And I mean in Chicago, because right on the other side of this wall is one of the runways of O'Hare Airport. Right over here is Kennedy Expressway. Pam has 1/10 of an acre. That is 3 times smaller than the average lot size in North America. And she's totally isolated. She's not connected to any natural area at all. So it's a pretty 1/10 of an acre, but she did the same thing. She got rid of her invasive plants, put in 60 species of native plants, plus a water feature. And then she sat back and started to count the birds that are using. I mean, you count birds, that's just a good ecological indicator of what's happening in your yard. And she's up to 120 species that have used her yard, including a woodcock. There's Pam's woodcock. So if you haven't seen a woodcock lately, go to Chicago and check it out at Pam's house. What about city centers, though? 82% of us live in cities. Are all those people going to miss out on this fun? Well, in 2014, I was looking at this plant, Asclepias tuberosa. People call it butterfly weed, which reminds me, we've got a serious marketing issue with our native plants. We call them weeds. I wonder why people don't plant them. So let's not call this butterfly weed anymore. Let's call it Monarch's Delight. So staring at Monarch's Delight, 2014, and the first thing I saw were 2 species of leafcutter bees, megachilid bees, a big one and a small one. I know they're megachilid bees because they've got pollen on their tummy, not on their legs. But they have very strict requirements. You don't have leafcutter bees unless you have pollen and nectar and an access to soft leaves. And things like redbud are perfect because they cut the edges of those leaves out, make little semicircles, and roll up what they've cut out into a tube, stuff it full of pollen, and then lay an egg on it, and then put the whole package into a crack or a crevice, and that's how they reproduce. Well, there was a redbud growing right next to Monarch's Delight, and I'm sure that's why there were leafcutter bees there. Pretty sure that's why there were bumblebees there too, a couple of species. Remember, bumblebees overwinter as queens. So when they come out in the spring, they don't have any helpers. They're all alone. They've got to start the colony all by themselves. So they need access to a lot of pollen and a lot of nectar that is easily gathered. And that's exactly what redbud supplies. So I'm sure that had a lot to do with the success of the bumblebees where I was. And then I saw a monarch. Actually, I saw 2 monarchs foraging on Monarch's Delight. Now, this was 2014. 2013, I'd gone the entire year without seeing a single monarch. That was the low point of the monarch population east of the Rockies. Only 3.6% of the monarchs were left compared to 1976. And this was June, which is early for us up this far north to be seeing monarchs. It takes them a long time to get up here. So I was impressed. Maybe they weren't going to disappear after all. It was a great day. Why were they there? Well, they had Monarch's Delight, but they also had another species. I think it's purple milkweed, which means that they had nectar, but they had their host plant. That's what they really need: a place to lay their eggs, a place to increase their population. Everything they needed. Do you know where I was? I was on the High Line in the middle of Manhattan, the middle of New York City. The High Line is an elevated railroad that had been abandoned for decades. Finally, somebody went up there and noticed there were a bunch of native plants growing there. Nobody planted them. They came in themselves. So they said, let's make this a tourist destination. And they did. They fixed it all up. This is the planting along the High Line. It's a 3-foot strip of plants that follows this elevated railroad. But it's been enormously successful as a tourist destination. Literally millions of people visit the High Line every year. This is Rick Dark. He was always after me to go see the plantings on the High Line. I'm not much of a city boy, so I always drag my feet. And seeing beautiful plants that nothing is using is actually depressing to me. And that's what I thought I would see on the High Line. I mean, here we are 30 feet above the taxis, right in the middle of everything. That's not much nature. What's going to find that? Well, everything I described to you found it. And somebody's just finished a study of the native bees using the High Line. They're up to 30 species so far. Birds are there. So I was completely wrong. Even modest additions of native plants can restore a good part of nature, even in very rigorous situations. So if we can succeed in Manhattan, we can succeed anywhere. There are 4 things we need to think about if we're going to succeed in a big way, and we need to succeed in a big way. And one of them is we've got to shrink the area we have in lawn. Got too much lawn. We got over 40 million acres of lawn, and that's a 2005 statistic. So it's bigger than that now. It's dedicated to an ecological deadscape. It's dedicated to a status symbol. And I understand about human status symbols. We're not going to get rid of those. But let's cut the area of lawn in half. The area we keep will still be manicured. We'll still be good citizens. Our neighbors will still love us. But we're going to put plants in the half that we take out of lawn. And if we do that in half the area that is in lawn, that'll give us 20 million acres. By the way, 40 million acres is the size of New England right now. We're talking about a big area. So we could restore nature on 20 million acres with what is now lawn. And if we do that at home, we can create a new national park that we can call Homegrown National Park. And it'll be bigger than the Adirondacks, plus Yellowstone, plus Yosemite, plus Grand Tetons, Canyonlands, Mount Rainier, North Cascades, plus Badlands National Park, Olympic National Park, Sequoia National Park, plus the Grand Canyon, plus Denali, which is huge, plus the Great Smoky Mountains. You add up all those parks, still less than 20 million acres. So Homegrown National Park be the biggest national park in the country. What do you get when you put some part of nature right where you live? You get the opportunity to develop a personal relationship with that part of the natural world. And you can do it at your own time and your own pace. All you have to do is go outside. You can avoid crowds. I don't know if you saw the New York Times last week, I guess, talking about the crowds in our national parks. You go to a real national park now, there are millions of people there, and it's standing room only. Tough to develop that personal relationship when you got everybody standing around. It's also free. There's no admission fee. It's never closed, no matter what pandemic comes down the pike. No travel hassles. You get to experience the natural world alone, which I think is the only way you can develop that personal relationship. You and Mother Nature alone, not mediated by anybody else. And this is particularly important for our kids. Why? Because our kids are the future stewards of the planet. If they don't know what they're stewarding, if they don't know why they need to steward, they're going to be lousy stewards. And they're suffering from nature deficit disorder, according to Richard Louv. So we're trying, we get 30 kids, we put them on a bus with a teacher. They travel for an hour, then they walk around a natural place for an hour. The teacher tells them not to touch anything. They get back on the bus and they go home. And I'm sure that's better than nothing. But what they've really experienced is 30 other kids and a teacher telling them not to touch anything. If they have part of nature at home, they have the opportunity of developing that personal relationship alone. Send your kids outside without parental supervision. Let them work it out alone. And maybe they will learn how to hunt lizards. I'm learning this from my own granddaughter, Zoe, who lives in Hawaii in a very modest piece of nature. It's a patch of grass and a hedge, but there are no lizards there. And she discovered that and sent me this slide explaining how you hunt a Noah lizard. You get on the ground and you cover yourself with sticks and leaves so the lizards don't see you coming. And then you crawl very slowly toward the lizard. No smiling. This is serious business. You can wear your best dress, that's okay. But you can sneak up on the lizard, catch the lizard, put it in an aquarium, learn how to take care of the lizard, learn how to be a good steward of the natural world. And there's your personal relationship. Now, I don't think Zoe's going to be crawling on the ground in her best dress the rest of her life catching lizards. I don't think. She sent me this picture not long ago, so who knows. But I guarantee she's going to remember catching lizards in Hawaii when she was a small girl. And I also guarantee that's going to help her be a good steward of the planet when she grows up. If you want your kids to do more than catch lizards, get Nancy Stranisti's Nature Play at Home. One or dozens of examples of how to expose your kids to nature right where they live. And if you want to join Homegrown National Park, you can do it. Go to homegrownnationalpark.org, our website, and get yourself on the map. This is our attempt at reaching people that are not in the choir already. the people who don't know that their little piece of the earth is an important part of conservation. We want to raise awareness. We want to motivate people. We want to give them resources to help them get started, help them stay engaged. That's what it's all about. So you can get yourself on the map by, I guess we're down here now. You put in your information for where you live and the amount of area you're going to take out of lawn. And then we're trying to reach that 20 million acre goal to create homegrown national park. So we're going to shrink the lawn. What plants are we going to put in the area that we take out of lawn? Well, I'm going to argue that at least some of them have to be what I call keystone plants. Remember what a keystone is? This is the Roman arch. The keystone is the stone in the middle of the arch. And if you take that stone out of the arch collapses. Well, if you take keystone plants out of the food web collapses because they're making most of the food. Just 5% of our native plants are making 75% of the caterpillar food that drives the food webs. Plants are making 90% of the caterpillar food that drives those food webs, which means 85 or 86% of the plants, of the native plants, are not contributing all that much. So think of the keystone plants in your yard. You're building an ecological house in your yard. They're the 2x4s in your house. They're essential. They're going to hold up your house. You can't build a house out of wallpaper, but they're not the only thing you're building your house out of. So they're essential, an essential component, but not the only component. The question is no longer simply, are natives better than non-natives? On average, they certainly are. But I can easily build an all-native landscape that produces very little because there are some natives that don't produce very much. The question really is, do we want native species that are really good at supporting pollinators and caterpillars, or do we want the natives that aren't? That's the question. I get an email from somebody once in a while saying, don't you know that ginkgos, ginkgo biloba from Asia, actually grew in North America 7 million years ago? That makes them native. That means you can plant them and everything will be great. Well, yes, I do know that ginkgos grew in North America 7 million years ago. We can argue about whether that makes them native today, but I'm not going to have that argument because that's not the metric anymore. It's not whether they're native or not. It's whether they're productive or not. Are they doing anything? I don't care if ginkgos grew in the moon 7 million years ago. They support 0 species of caterpillars. They are not contributing to the local food web. Your chickadee will starve if you only give them ginkgos. What's the most productive keystone plant in 84% of the counties in which they occur? It's one of the oaks, genus Quercus. In the mid-Atlantic states, they support 557 species of caterpillars. In the entire nation, they support over 950 species. No other plant genus comes close to that. And this is the role that keystone oaks are playing in our yard here in Oxford, Pennsylvania. Now remember, I've taken pictures of 1,125 moss species so far. Haven't gotten to the butterflies yet. I will. Out of the 1,125 moss species, 980 have known host plants. Out of those 980, 287 of them use oaks. And we've got 69 genera of native woody plants on our property, and only one of them is the genus Quercus, the oaks. And we've got hundreds of genera of herbaceous plants. So oaks represent less than 1.5% of our woody plant diversity and way less than 1% of our total plant diversity, but they're supporting 29% of our moss species diversity, and maybe higher than that because there's 100 and some on that we don't know what they're eating. That's the power of keystone plant in your yard. If I took oaks out of my yard, what would happen to the diversity? It would crash. How do you find out what the keystone plants are? Where you live, you go to Native Plant Finder on the National Wildlife Federation website, and you put in your zip code, and the ranked list of both the woody and herbaceous plants that are best at producing the caterpillars that run our food webs will pop up. This is what a typical list looks like in many places around the country. Oaks are going to be number one, followed by very closely by native cherries and native willows, birches, acer, maples, and cottonwood becomes really important as you move further out west. Notice I say native, native, native. If I go to the nursery and I say I want to buy a cherry, I guarantee they will sell me an ornamental cherry from China. If I want to buy a willow, they'll sell me a weeping willow from Turkey. If I want to buy a birch, it'll probably be a European birch. And you've got to specify that you want a native member of these genera, because if you don't, it's going to cut caterpillar use by 65%. We've done that study. These are the top herbaceous plants in many places of the country. Goldenrod, solidago, the various genera that asters were broken up into, sunflowers. Just those three alone will support dozens of species of well, actually, solidago supports 110 species of caterpillars alone, but they're also really good at supporting specialist bees. When you're making a pollinator garden, you want to plant for the specialist bees because the generalists can use those plants too. Honeybees are generalists. You can use lots of plants. But if you only plant for honeybees and bumblebees, the specialists drop out. So you lose dozens of species of specialist bees if you don't use those plant genera. And if you're from Canada, you can get the same information up there. Okay, we are going to shrink the lawn. We're going to put in keystone plants and bring a lot of insects into our yard. And then we're going to kill them at our security light. And that, of course, is not the goal. There's a lot of research coming out, particularly from Europe, demonstrating that light pollution at night is one of the major causes of insect decline. And these are all the ways that they kill nocturnal insects. You know, to me, believe it or not, this is good news because we have to turn around insect declines. We've already lost 45% of the insects on planet Earth. Remember, they're the little things that run the world. They're the little things that keep us alive. Can't lose them. We've got to not just keep things where they are, but increase their populations again. And if we can do that by flicking a switch, turning out our lights, we're getting off easy. But I know what you're going to say. Oh, I can't turn the light out over my garage because the bad man will come. Okay, put a motion sensor on your light so that it only turns on when the bad man does come. And the first thing you're going to recognize is that the bad man doesn't come very often. And if you don't want to do that, take the white bulb out of your security light and put in a yellow bulb. A yellow LED bulb is the best because yellow wavelengths are the least attractive to nocturnal insects. If we switched out our white security bulbs for yellow bulbs, overnight we would save billions of insects and probably billions of dollars too, because LEDs are much more energy efficient. Okay, we're going to shrink the lawn. We're going to put in keystone plants. We're going to turn out our lights. And then we're going to invite Mosquito Joe to come kill all of our insects. Mosquito Joe is single-handedly undoing everything I've been talking about for the last 15 years. And he will say, well, it's okay because this is a natural product. And it is. It's pyrethroids. It's made from chrysanthemum, but cyanide's a natural product too. So that's not a good argument. He'll also say it only kills mosquitoes. And that's where he goes astray because that's not even close to true. I don't know if you saw the headlines last year, but in several places, including Texas, there were big monarch kills when they flew through Mosquito Joe's handiwork. Can't afford to do that, folks. So this hits tons of non-target insects. And the big thing is it doesn't control mosquitoes. In order to control mosquitoes in the adult stage, you have to kill 90% of the adults. Mosquito Joe kills between 10% and 50%. So he's not even close to actually controlling mosquitoes. And he's expensive. So you're paying a lot of money to kill non-target insects without killing the mosquitoes. If you really want to control mosquitoes, you control them in the larval stage. Get a bucket. People say, how big a bucket? Doesn't matter. Bigger the better. Fill it full of water, put in a handful of straw or hay, and let it kind of cook in the sun. Let it ferment for a couple of days. What you're doing is building up the diatom populations and the algae populations in your bucket. And that becomes irresistible to female mosquitoes that want to lay their eggs. They will lay their eggs in your bucket. The eggs hatch, then you put in a mosquito dunk. You get it at the hardware store. This is Bacillus thuringiensis. It's cheap, by the way, $9 for the whole thing. Bacillus thuringiensis, a formulation that only kills aquatic diptera. And the only aquatic diptera in your bucket is a mosquito. So if a dragonfly gets in there, it's not gonna hurt it. If your dog licks it or a bird drinks it, it's not gonna hurt it a bit. You've got a cheap, targeted control of mosquitoes. And if everybody did this, you would control your mosquitoes a whole lot better than Mosquito Joe that doesn't control your mosquitoes, but does kill all the other insects. Okay, the fourth thing we need to think about is landscaping in a way that allows caterpillars to complete their development. What do I mean by that? Well, I live in Chester County, Pennsylvania, where oaks support 511 species of caterpillars. A few of them, like the polyphemus moth, complete their development on the tree. The caterpillar eats the leaves, then it spins a cocoon, hangs from one of the branches, then it emerges as an adult, and then it does it again. Everything happens on the tree. And I wish all the caterpillars did that, but most of them don't. Most of them, and it's not just from oaks, but most caterpillars finish growing on their host plant, then they drop from the tree and they wiggle their way beneath the ground and pupate underground, or they spin a cocoon in the leaf litter that's under the tree. And that's the problem. There is no leaf litter under the tree. And we mow and compact our soils to the point where they're rock hard and the caterpillar cannot get underground. So the way we landscape across the country, and I'm convinced this is another major cause of insect declines, creates ecological traps. We call them the adult moths. They lay their eggs, the caterpillars grow, and they drop down and they die. And of course, the cement landscape is even less of a viable option. This is what most people do. They have a tree and they put it in a big lawn. Nobody's measured how well caterpillars do in a situation like this, although we're starting a project this year trying to figure that out. But I guarantee they do better in a situation like this, where you have a tree and then a layered landscape, maybe a dogwood here, a native azalea, ferns, ground cover. Caterpillar drops down into a safe site. Nobody's going to step on it. Nobody's going to mow it. The soil is not compacted. They can wiggle their way down. They can spin a cocoon in the leaf litter that's under here. Much higher survivorship. This is where you should do your spring ephemeral gardening. Put big beds around your trees. Make them safe sites. This is how you reduce the lawn. You're filling the area that was lawn with plants. This is where you can use your ground covers like wild ginger or May apples or foam flower, Jack in the Pulpit, all those ground covers. Ferns. This is Athens, Georgia, the middle of Athens, Georgia. It's a hotel. These are red maples. Any caterpillar developing these red maples can fall down and complete their development here, even though it's the middle of the city. So we can do a whole lot better and building food webs where we humans have our landscapes, if we think about the landscape under the trees. Another grad student, Desiree Narango, who did some wonderful job with chickadees in the suburbs of Washington, D.C., and the results of her study suggest there's actually room for compromise in our plant choices. What she did was ask the question, how well do landscapes that are dominated by native plants sustain chickadee populations compared to landscapes dominated by introduced plants? And when they were dominated by introduced plants, they produced 75% fewer caterpillars. So right away, the amount of bird food was reduced by 75%. They were 60% less likely to have breeding chickadees at all. Now, there was a nest box up in each yard, but the chickadees would come and look around and say, there's not enough food here. We're not even going to try to reproduce. If they did try to reproduce, those nests contained 1.5 fewer eggs. Those clutches were 29% less likely to survive at all. If they did survive, they produced 1.2 fewer fledglings. And it took them 1.5 days longer to do that. And if you put all that information into a population growth model as a function of the percentage of non-native woody plant biomass in your yard from 0 to 100%, and we focused on woody plant biomass because that's where chickadees forage, this is what you get. This dotted line is replacement rate. That's the rate at which the population has to make babies to replace the adults that die every year. If you reproduce at this rate, you have a sustainable population. It's not growing, but it's not shrinking either. If you make more babies than adults die, you have a growing population. But if you make fewer babies, anywhere down in here, where you've got a lot of non-native plants, that's an unsustainable shrinking population. Right here is, generously speaking, is where those lines overlap, which suggests you can have up to 30% of your woody plant biomass non-native. Can't be invasive, no calorie pairs, no burning bush. But you can have your forsythia, you can have your ginkgos, you can have your camellias. Those things aren't moving around. As long as it's doesn't exceed 30%, you can have a sustainable breeding population of birds. So this is exciting to me because this is the area of compromise. If I said you can't have any non-native plants, very few people would be listening. We love our non-native plants. Remember, it's not the presence of non-native plants that destroys food webs. It's the absence of the native plants that support those food webs. So if we increase the percentage of native plants, We can tolerate a number of these. Can we use natives informal gardens? Of course we can. I got this picture from Lynn O'Shaughnessy. This is her garden. It's taken from a drone 400 feet up. You don't get more formal than that. Every plant in that garden is a native plant. So remember, formality is a function of the design. It's not a function of the plants in the design. Our native plants are used in formal designs in Europe all the time. I guess it's okay because they're non-native plants over there. Can we get a pollinator garden in a typical suburban yard like this without offending anybody? Of course we can. You just put a little fence around it. It formalizes it. It tells people this is intentional. It's not just a pile of weeds. It's beautiful. It's meeting the needs of a number of species of native bees. It's not very big. Could be bigger. That'd be great. Remember why we need pollinators. You hear all the time because they pollinate a third of our crops. That's a terrible argument because people say, well, I don't live next to a farm, so I don't need any pollinators. Forget that argument. It's actually about a 1/12 of our crops. We need pollinators because they pollinate 80% of all plants and 90% of all flowering plants. Where do we need pollinators? Everywhere we need plants, which is everywhere. How about this design? Drew Latham design, much bigger. Imagine the amount of life supported here versus the amount of life supported here. Seems like a no-brainer. Can municipalities help us live with nature? Of course they can. And more of them are doing it. Minnesota kicked it off a couple of years ago with a called a lawn to legume program, a cost sharing program where the state pays people to convert some or all of their lawn to appropriate Minnesota prairie plants. Very successful. Pennsylvania's got a new program. It's only 2 years old. You can get up to $5,000 per acre of lawn that you convert to native plants. It was designed to help watersheds because lawns destroy watersheds. But think of the biodiversity benefits of a program like this. Florida, they're paying people in an island off Florida to allow burrowing owls to burrow in the front yard. Burrowing owls are listed species. This is the way the Endangered Species Act should have been written, with carrots rather than sticks. If you have an endangered species on your property, we're going to pay you to take care of it rather than fine you if you walk on your property. No brainer. Everybody would want an endangered species. Missouri and Fayetteville, Arkansas have a bounty on calorie pear. You take out a Bradford pear, calorie pear, and you get a free tree replacement. And you know, you've probably heard of San Antonio's policy giving people $100 coupons to put in water efficient native plants instead of the thirsty non-natives. And of course, the very successful lawn conversion programs in the far west, particularly California, up to $2 per square foot rebate by getting rid of your lawn and putting in appropriate xeric plants. I think we made 3 missteps in the early years of conservation. The first one's a serious one. We've come to think of nature as optional. We don't need it, not essential. And of course, if it's not essential, when push comes to shove, nature takes a back seat. Resources are always in short supply. Push always comes to shove, so nature's always taking a back seat. Went to the Cincinnati Zoo before the virus broke out, and there was a wall side poster there, which to me epitomizes our society's view of conservation. We want to save nature, save wildlife so that future generations can enjoy it. That was Teddy Roosevelt's argument for creating the national park system. Got to save these wonderful places from destruction so the future generations can enjoy them. And I get that, but that suggests nature is there just for entertainment. No wonder we don't think it's essential. It's far more important than entertainment. We need to save nature so that we have future generations. A little bit more urgent. We've also assumed that humans and nature cannot coexist. Now, by restricting conservation just to places where we don't have a lot of humans, we're condemning them to failure because those places are too small and too isolated from each other for conservation to work. David Quammen has a wonderful analogy between a Persian rug and an ecosystem. This is the functional Persian rug. That is not 71 Persian rugs. That's 71 rug fragments, none of which are acting like a Persian rug. And that's what we've done to our ecosystems. The UN designates biosphere reserves as places of ecological significance. And I hate that language because it suggests there are places on planet Earth that don't have ecological significance. Not so. Every square inch of the planet has ecological significance, including our yards, including our roadsides, including our corporate landscapes, even including our agriculture. So we need to glue our rug back together again by putting the plants back, not just making biological carters that allow plants and animals to move back and forth between viable habitats, but to create viable habitats where we've destroyed them, where we live, work, play, farm. For the first time in modern history, we're going to start to coexist with the natural world. Our third misstep was to leave Earth stewardship just to a few specialists, few ecologists, few conservation biologists. We didn't see it as an inherent responsibility of everybody on the planet, but I don't know why, because everybody on the planet depends entirely on the quality of Earth's ecosystems. So why wouldn't everybody have the responsibility of good Earth stewardship? I don't know. Stan Rushworth, Cherokee elder, once said that the Western settler mindset was, I have rights. The mindset of indigenous people is, I have obligations. You are not born with these mindsets, you're taught them. We've been great at teaching this one. We've been terrible at teaching our kids and our peers that everybody has an obligation to good Earth stewardship. That doesn't mean you have to save biodiversity for a living, but you really can save it where you live. And if you do, it empowers you. Right now, so many people feel powerless. The Earth's problems are huge. What can one person do? Well, one person can shrink the lawn. One person can get rid of their invasive plants. One person can put in a pollinator garden. One person can use keystone species. One person can turn out the lights. One person can totally revitalize the little ecosystem in their yard and contribute, enhance their local ecosystem instead of degrade it. And it also shrinks the problem down to something that's manageable for each one of us. Don't think about the entire planet's problem. You get depressed. Just think about your little piece of the Earth, the piece that you can influence. If you own property, that's obvious. That's where you're going to focus. If you don't own property, help somebody who does. Help a park, help a preserve, help a land conservancy. They're all underfunded. They're all understaffed. They will love you as a volunteer. So as property owners or volunteers, each one of us has the power, and we certainly have the responsibility to fix dead landscapes like this. Whether or not we do so is going to determine nature's fate and then ultimately our own fate. And I think I've convinced my grandkids that you are nature's best hope. I hope I've convinced you as well. Thanks very much.
Well, thank you, Doug. Compelling as always. Really do appreciate your delivery and your candor and just the information that you're bringing. I took some notes, and so right now we do a portion that we do a Q&A bit. So Doug will be here to answer some questions. You can raise your hand. There's a little button down there on your little thing. Raise your hand, or you can just put it in the chat, and we'll put it to Doug. Doug, I'm all in. I love the homegrownnationalpark.org idea. I think that's awesome. Totally going to sign up. I have a lawn that we use for kids, but the kids are all old and boring now, and so we'll put in a bunch of native plant spaces there. But I was intrigued by carotenoids, and is it something where we as kind of gardener horticulture people can focus on increasing the carotenoids in plants? That's something that's worth focusing on?
That's a good question. They do vary in the type of plant that is there. I have not thought about actually gardening to increase carotenoids. I thought about gardening to increase the caterpillars that will deliver those carotenoids, but that's a good question. Certainly, you're getting more carotenoids out of carrots and things like that.
Yeah, well, I just it seems.
You know what? I would need a list of the different carotenoids that are in different plant species and see how they stack up. Good question. Can't answer it.
Well, maybe it's the next project after Homegrown National Park.
Maybe, yeah.
Yeah. Well, getting a lot of just thanks so much, great talk. But if you guys have questions, don't be afraid to do it. I think that giving us kind of like practical steps like Homegrown National Park and Native Plant Finder are great. Houston does have a ton of oaks. I look out my window and I think I see 6 straight out there. And I looked at the Native Plant Finder kind of app, and I'm wondering about some of our weeds. I wonder if that's something like, I wrote down some of the most weeds that we the most questions on the radio show, and it's dollarweed, Virginia buttonweed, horse herb, clover. Any of those kind of ring a bell as ones that we just need to like, whoa, let those alone. Those are great caterpillar food.
We're getting ready to launch a keystone plant for pollinators part of the website. And so that would be able to answer that. Which ones are going to support the most specialized?
Yeah.
So the list I showed you is designed around caterpillars, but Jared Fowler has been working with the National Wildlife Federation website to not by county, but by bioregion, which plant genera are supporting the most specialist bees. So yes, that information is just about ready. And that would direct you toward those weeds you're talking about. I'm not sure which ones they are, but yeah. Things like clover, we got native clover, but the clover that's in everybody's yard is not a native yet. It's a great pollinator and pollen source for generalist bees. You see honeybees and bumblebees on it all the time. And compared to a lawn without it, it contributes a lot, so and that's when I grew up, in the early 50s, everybody had clover in their lawn. That's how you fertilized it. The clover was putting the nitrogen back in the lawn. That's how I got my first bee sting, by running through my lawn with my bare feet. But the only reason we don't have clover now is because the lawn companies say you're not a good person if you have it. There's no other reason.
Absolutely. And looking on there, notes I've had kind of in the past, it's like sunflowers, goldenrod, bluebonnets are actually a pretty big host one. And so it sounds like that making wildflower spaces where we've got sunny spaces might be a way. You mentioned under the trees, but maybe where we don't have trees and we have sun, maybe wildflower spaces.
Sure, absolutely.
Okay, great. Yeah, well, there's a lot of places to get wildflower mixes in the area. We will now get to the question. Well, I usually ask a couple questions just to build some time, Doug, so that people can write their questions in here. So thanks for answering my question. So here we go. So this one's from Bob Randall, Dr. Bob Randall, I might add. In urban and suburban lots, are 2 or 3 lots sufficient for a renewal?
Yeah, another good question that nobody's done the research for. How big a space do you need for it to be effective? My answer to that is a single little clump of milkweed in a single pot on your porch is better than nothing, because I know the monarchs will use that. I also will say the bigger the better. So it's a continuum. I don't want people to think that they live in a yard that's too small to make a contribution. But of course, the goal is to get your neighbor to do it too, to make it an entire neighborhood operation. Many things like migrating birds, migrating monarchs, a number of butterflies migrate, but they will use productive parts of the landscape as they move through. So if you have space for a single tree and it's one of those oaks, that's where the migrants are going to stop, even if it's not nearly big enough to support a breeding bird. So anything helps is my answer to that. But of course, the more the merrier.
That is wonderful. I mean, we live next to a bird sanctuary, luckily, here at my house, and I found, you had a picture of them, but the little caterpillar cocoons that get down to the soil, I find them in my veggie beds all the time, and I'm always so excited to do it. Now, before I learned what they look like, I was like, what the heck, it's out of here, probably a roach larvae or something like that. I'm not an entomologist, so, I was like, but I was happy to learn that they were actually caterpillars doing that, so that's awesome. All right, next question here is from Christy Harvey, and she says, so we have a product we use a lot to control mosquitoes called garlic barrier. And a few people on here could actually speak to what that actually is a little bit better than I can. But she says, so the garlic that mosquito guy uses in the lawns is terrible? That's her question.
I don't know about the garlic. I suspect it doesn't kill the mosquitoes. It's creates a chemical barrier that discourages them from being there. That's different from the pyrethroid that lands on them and kills them. So, so I don't, I've never heard of any of these natural mosquito repellents actually killing other insects. We're really targeting those pyrethroids that Mosquito Joe is fogging the world with, driving down the center of the street and go, whether you want it or not.
Right.
That's the bad guy.
Well, and then I would really appreciate you showing those mosquito dunks, a solid version of BT, because you're not overspraying that on the leaves. You're just putting that in the soil. And
Exactly.
I
Well,
thought that was such an
put it
interesting
in
approach.
your bucket. There are different BTs. So there are BT that go for caterpillars. There are BTs for, other things, but this is one that is designed for aquatic dipter. But you make your bucket, you make your little habitat, and then it's really targeted.
Awesome. And our next question here is from Clay, um, with a really cool last name, starts with a Z. You don't see those very often. So, but Clay's question is, and a kind of a fun one: what caterpillar were you most excited about to find on your property?
The hickory horn devil. First time I found that, it was that's the biggest caterpillar in the country, and it's pretty spectacular. That's also, they're already extirpated from New England, so it's one of these ones in trouble. But the coolest caterpillar is probably the spun glass slug caterpillar. It looks like spun glass. I mean, it's just gorgeous.
Awesome. Well, I wrote those two down. So, Clay, great question there. Elizabeth says that she's been working on growing natives in her yard and she loves salvias. So I might just stop there and say, what's your take on salvias in general as a habitat or a caterpillar attractant?
We've got an entire list of all of the plant genera in every county of the country, and I'd have to look it up.
Okay.
Pretty sure it's not near the top. There's generally the woody plants are supporting a lot more than the herbaceous plants in terms of numbers of species. But again, our list is based on caterpillars. It's not, we're based on pollinators, and whether or not that's got specialist pollinators associated with it, not sure. Have to look it up.
Okay, gotcha. And we can always review that native plant finder thing too. I really encourage everybody that's there. That's a great thing for you to look at and punch in your zip code and see what's the best for you to have. So her second part is she ends up with tiny snails and whiteflies, and then anything she can do to alter this pattern. I would say some really good compost down by the roots of those plants will build up their immune system, and they'll fight off those whiteflies at least. And then tiny snails are just a product of our.
You know what eats snails and slugs? Fireflies.
Fireflies.
Firefly larvae. That's what they're predators of. Also box turtles, but so in order, how do you have fireflies? You got to have leaf litter. That's where they're hunting these things. Whiteflies, if they're a problem in the garden, it's probably the greenhouse whitefly, which it's not a native. It's it's an invasive insect without its natural enemies, and they're all a problem because they don't have their natural enemies. So there are some native whiteflies that are out there, but the one that goes crazy is usually the non-native.
Yeah, gotcha. Thanks for that. Vicky's got a little comment for us, and you kind of touched on why it might be the case, but she says we need to add more clover to our lawns. 40 years ago, clover seed was actually included in grass seed. Now it's a weed, but I love what you said about how it was
it's only fertilizer. Because Scott's Turf Builder tells us it is. So you don't have to believe them.
Yes, they're a horn devil of their own. Okay, so Carmelo, one of our board members, a wonderful guy, says, what's your recommendation to eradicate invasive plants in an organic way?
Yeah, you have to kill the root system. So you guys know a lot more about organics than I do. And if there are good organic products that can kill the root system, share it. I don't, when you spray a typical herbicide, you always hit non-targets. So there's many downsides there. The typical recommendation to minimize the use of an herbicide is to cut the woody off at the base and then just paint it. So you're using very little material. But things like Oriental bittersweet and autumn olive, or maybe you've got Russian olive, you can cut it off a million times, but if you don't kill that root system, it just never goes away. So what are the good organics that would do it? I hear, you hear what, vinegar and some other things. So it takes a lot of vinegar. I'm not sure. It's a challenge, but I do know that simply you can kill a plant by cutting it off repeatedly till you've drained the root system of its energy. But by repeatedly, I mean every 2 weeks, and sometimes for years. So if you're willing to do that, you don't have to use any herbicide, or you can cover it with black plastic if it's a small area. Some people have talked about cutting off woodies and then putting a black plastic bag around the trunk and tying it off and just leaving it there, that will work. All of those are not using any herbicide, but they take a good deal of time and effort. So there's always a trade-off.
Yeah, and Carmelo probably has just as much experience with anybody else that we've ever known, and having to deal with this situation over and over and over. So,
if he has some surefire, because I get that question a lot, and I don't have a good answer.
He said he'd send us a thumbs up and a handshake, which he's like, "Hey, awesome, great."
Okay.
But yeah, I mean, there's nothing that's perfect, that's for sure. Nothing that's perfect.
Yeah, excavate.
Yeah, we don't have those tools. Okay, so we're going to do 2 more questions here. First one here is from Kat. She says, in community gardens, how should we evaluate? I was thinking the same thing, Kat, so I'm glad you asked it. How should we evaluate some of our Asian/foreign vegetable plants and fruits that maybe won't be as supportive of our native bee and caterpillar population?
Well, our vegetable gardens are there for a different purpose. They're there to feed us, and local food growing is a wonderful thing. So they're not designed to support our biodiversity. We've got to grow the plants that we eat. Now there are people who talk about bringing in other species of Elaeagnus that have berries that are high in this and that. Please don't do that, because we know that genus is highly invasive, and we're not that stressed for food that we need to introduce new species that we know are going to escape. But our typical vegetable gardens, they're there for veggies and not, things like tomatoes. It's a solanaceous plant, and it's good for those buzz pollinators. Things like bumblebees are really good at that. So,
well, here we also get a really big hornworm on tomatoes at the end of their season.
The tobacco hornworm and the tomato hornworm, yeah.
Pretty good food for some of our birds. I think mockingbirds, bluebirds, and sparrows. Mm-hmm. That's cool. Yeah, I mean, maybe start bird watching at your veggie garden and just see what happens. If you get a bird bath in there, you'll start seeing some birds, and maybe you'll see what they eat.
We did an experiment years ago where we were growing plants, and we wanted to compare natives and non-natives. And there was a bluebird that used to sit on the fence, and as soon as we left, it would go down and eat everything we were trying to measure. so the birds can have a really big impact on your garden. Single birds.
Yeah, we talk about on the show pretty often how important it is to leave your tomatoes open on the inside, because if you don't, you get armyworms in there, and lots of wasps and lots of birds will feed on those armyworms if you give them.
Yeah.
All right, so Clay says nice. Lance has a really cool comment there, just saying check out that website, the nfw.org, Native Plant Finder, and you'll find some good stuff. So, and then Beth has our last question, and it is the nematode used to kill fire ants harmful to caterpillars?
No, that's very specific. Nematode,
kind of like the BT. Very
much like the BT, yeah. They don't jump from thing to thing. They're very specific on their target. Yeah.
It's pretty wild to think of, like, a lot of the birds eat a specific caterpillar that are eaten by a specific nematode or bacteria that are eaten by, it's like wild to think like specialization keeps going down or sideways, I guess.
Well, that's why we call it a food web instead of a linear chain. Because look at that one oak tree, it supports hundreds of species and many things eat them, and it very quickly webs out instead of straight one eating one.
Yeah, absolutely. I'm very happy that the schools have changed that language also. So, well, our next couple events are in August, the August workshops and the awesome movie showing we're doing over in Fayette County. So go there, obaonline.org, to check out what's coming. And Doug, any closing thoughts? Any things you want to make sure you really drive into our brains?
You are nature's best hope. Whether we have it in the future and us depends on, it's a global problem, the biodiversity crisis, but it does have a grassroots solution. So, and nobody's off the hook here. Everybody has a responsibility. So,
yeah,
that's my closing thought.
I definitely love that. Not only is living with nature an option, it's the only option. So I'll probably get a tattoo with that on it.
Good. All right.
Hey, well, thanks, man. Great job.
All right.
Love having you. Everybody, just so Doug will be in Houston, February 16th. The Garden Club of Houston's bringing you in for a fun showing, and they're making that free to the public. So you're an awesome dude, one of my heroes. Glad you're here, and so give him applause.
All right. Thanks very much. Take care, everybody.